fresh starts and final rites. It was supposed to be our fresh start, our chance to leave behind the city's noise and chaos. When we found the Victorian listed online, it felt like fate. The price was unbelievably low, and it had everything we'd ever wanted: towering gables, a wraparound porch, and those beautifully intricate woodwork details that made it look like it had a soul of its own. The realtor's video walkthrough showed sunbeams streaming through stained glass windows and a grand staircase that made me feel like we'd be living in a fairy tale. It seemed perfect, and we were desperate enough to take that chance. The day we arrived, the sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, bathing the house in a warm, golden glow. It stood there, grand and silent, like it was waiting for us. I remember glancing at my husband, James, and seeing that spark of excitement in his eyes that had been missing for years. Even our daughter, Josie, seemed enthralled, her little face pressed against the window as we pulled into the driveway. "It's so pretty, Mommy," she whispered, and I squeezed her hand, feeling like we'd made the right decision. The first week was blissful. Sure, the house had its quirks: creaky floorboards, drafts that seemed to come from nowhere, and the occasional flickering light, but that was part of its charm. We busied ourselves with unpacking, setting up our new life and exploring the little town that had already begun to feel like home. Josie spent hours playing in her new room, chattering away about her imaginary friends. It wasn't until she mentioned Charlotte that I started to feel uneasy. "She's my best friend, Mommy," Josie announced one morning over breakfast, her eyes bright with excitement. "She used to live here a long, long time ago. She says her daddy built this house just for her." James and I exchanged amused looks. "Is that right?" I asked. "What else does Charlotte say?" Josie frowned thoughtfully, her spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "She says the house is very old, but I already knew that," she said matter-of-factly. "She wants to show me all the secret places." It wasn't unusual for kids to have imaginary friends, and I figured it was just her way of adjusting to the move. But as the days went on, I started to notice little things: tiny handprints on the dusty windows, too high up for Josie to reach, a child's laughter echoing through the halls when Josie was in bed. Charlotte, it seemed, was more than just a figment of Josie's imagination. I really was convinced when Josie came into the kitchen from the backyard one afternoon when I was baking cookies. She had a very old baby doll in her arms that she claimed was a gift from Charlotte. I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as I examined her. It was almost too lifelike, with delicate features molded into the wax, tiny glass eyes that seemed to be following my every movement, and a faint blush painted onto its cheeks. The dress it wore was tattered and faded, but the intricate lacework hinted at a time when it must have been beautiful. How on earth had my daughter come into possession of such an antique? And more importantly, who had left it in the backyard? "Are you sure Charlotte gave this to you, sweetheart?" I asked, keeping my voice calm even though my pulse was racing. Josie nodded, her curls bouncing. "Yes, Mommy. She said it used to be hers when she was little, but she doesn't need it anymore. She thought I might like it." I forced a smile, trying not to show how unnerved I was. "Well, that was very kind of her." That night, I found it difficult to sleep. My mind kept drifting back to the doll, with its unsettlingly realistic eyes and strangely heavy weight. I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't just a toy. It seemed to carry a history with it, one that whispered through the creaks and groans of the old house as the wind howled outside. Things grew stranger from there. Josie became inseparable from the doll, insisting it sleep in bed with her and accompany us wherever we went. At night, I would hear her whispering to it, the way children do with their favorite toys. But there was something different in the way Josie spoke to this doll, something almost reverent. And then, one morning, I noticed something odd. A tear had formed on the doll's face, right where its wax cheek had cracked, exposing the dull gray material beneath. It looked eerily like a scar. "Charlotte says her dolly got hurt," Josie explained when I asked about it, her little voice serious. But don't worry, Mommy. She says it'll heal soon. Goosebumps pricked my skin, and I decided it was time to do some more research. The morning I reached out to the local historical society, asking if they had any records of the house's previous owners or its history. An elderly woman named Mrs. Garrett agreed to meet with me, and I drove to her tiny home on the outskirts of town, hoping she might shed some light on what was going on. Mrs. Garrett's house was crammed with old photographs, books, and documents. She listened patiently as I explained the strange occurrences, nodding thoughtfully. When I mentioned the doll, her expression changed, becoming dark and troubled. "This house of yours," she said slowly, "used to be the Lawrence Funeral Parlor back in the late 1800s. It was one of the busiest in the county. Charlotte Lawrence was the daughter of the man who ran the business. She was just about your daughter's age when she was killed in a carriage accident outside of town." My heart skipped a beat. What happened to her? They say her father was so heartbroken that he refused to let her body leave the parlor. He prepared her himself, took care of everything. He dressed little Charlotte in her Sunday best and with her favorite doll. My blood ran cold in my veins when Mrs. Garrett spoke of an old sepia portrait taken just before they lowered her casket into the ground. When I returned home, James was standing at the sink, washing the dishes up from lunch. He gestured to an old photo album lying on the kitchen table. He said he'd been exploring in the attic that morning and had discovered it in an old box, along with a ledger and a stack of receipts. With trembling hands, I opened the weathered photo album, flipping through its pages filled with lifeless faces until I found the image exactly as Mrs. Garrett had described. There she was, Charlotte Lawrence lying peacefully in her tiny coffin, with Josie's baby doll tucked in next her. I buried my face into James' chest and burst into tears as he held me, telling me that everything was going to be okay. But how could it be? We bought a haunted funeral home, and our little daughter has befriended a ghost. That night, I decided to put the doll away, hoping that removing it from Josie's presence would help break whatever strange connection had formed. I placed it in a locked cabinet in the utility room and took a deep breath. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had taken back some control. The relief was short-lived. At around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of Josie's laughter echoing down the hallway. It wasn't the sweet, innocent giggle I was used to. It was low and hushed, like she was sharing a secret with someone. I bolted upright, heart pounding, and hurried to her room. There she was, sitting cross-legged on her bed, the doll cradled in her arms. "Josie, what are you doing?" I demanded, struggling to keep the panic out of my voice. "How did you get that?" She looked up at me, her eyes unnervingly wide and dark in the dim light. "Charlotte brought her back, Mommy," she said simply, as though that explained everything. "She said she doesn't like being locked up. It makes her angry." I snatched the doll from her arms, and for just a moment I could have sworn it felt warm, as if it had been holding on to some kind of life. Josie let out a wail that pierced through me, but I forced myself to turn away, determined to rid the house of the thing once and for all. That's when I heard the voice. "Why are you doing this? Don't you understand? She needs me." It was soft, almost gentle, but it wasn't coming from Josie. It was coming from the doll. I dropped it, stumbling back, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Josie's screams grew louder, more frantic, and she threw herself onto the floor, clawing at the doll as though trying to protect it. "You're hurting her," she cried. "Stop! Please!" The commotion woke James up. He grabbed her, pulling her away as she kicked and screamed, and that's when I noticed it. The doll's eyes had changed. What had once been lifeless glass now seemed to pulse with a dim, unnatural light, and its cracked face twisted into something that looked almost like a smile. We left the house that night, driving to a hotel on the outskirts of town, leaving the doll and everything behind. But when we woke the next morning, we were back at the house. I found Josie sitting by the window, the doll cradled in her lap. James yelled from the next room before appearing with the old photo album moments later. The image of Charlotte in her casket with her doll had somehow changed. Now the deceased little girl in Cephia somehow had Josie's face. On the opposite page was a photo of the undertaker and his wife, now struck a striking resemblance to James and I. It's been a week now, and we've tried leaving a dozen times. But every time we wake to eerie laughter echoing through the house, back where we started from. It's as if the house has claimed us, like we've become a part of its story now. And as I write this, I realize that maybe we always were.